A black waitress calls a billionaire CEO and says his son is unconscious. His reaction shocked all. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into today's story. It was a cold, stormy evening in San Francisco. The kind of night where the fog clings to the streets and the rain falls in sheets. Inside a high-end restaurant, Waitress Lounge, a place known for its exclusive clientele and opulent ambience, the last thing anyone expected was to witness a drama that would shake the very foundations of a powerful billionaire's world. Richard Kessler, the billionaire CEO of Kessler, sat at his usual spot at the head of a long mahogany table, surrounded by tech moguls, investors, and power players from Silicon Valley. The room hummed with the quiet buzz of conversation, wine glasses clinking, and the soft strains of classical music filling the air. Richard was a man who had built his empire with sharp intellect and ruthless ambition, a man who had made his fortune by controlling the narrative. But tonight, he would find that no amount of wealth or power, could control what was coming next. At the back of the room, a black waitress named Cassandra moved quietly between the tables, her presence nearly invisible to the guests. She wore the standard uniform of plain black and a tight bun, her hands steady as she served drinks and cleared plates. Her life had never been about glamour or recognition. Cassandra was used to being overlooked, to moving in the shadows. But this night, that would change. She was about to become the center of a storm no one in that room saw coming. As the guests chatted and laughed, the restaurant's atmosphere was suddenly interrupted by the harsh ring of a phone. The call was for Richard Kessler. He picked it up, his eyes narrowing as he listened. His face twisted in frustration. He seemed irritated, as though he had been interrupted at the height of a crucial conversation. But when the voice on the other end of the line spoke, Richard's face froze. "Mr. Kessler, your son is unconscious. We need you to come immediately." The words landed like a bombshell. The room went silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. Richard's grip tightened on the phone, his jaw clenched. His son, the heir to his vast fortune, the boy he had invested so much in, was in danger. For a moment, Richard's world shifted. But as quickly as the shock came, so did the skepticism. He set the phone down, his voice cold as he turned to his assistant, dismissing the call with an air of disbelief. "This is a prank," he said, trying to convince himself. "Someone's trying to mess with me." The assistant looked unsure, glancing nervously around the room. But Richard, a man used to controlling every situation, wasn't having it. He turned back to his meal, his mind racing, but his demeanor was calm, controlled, as always. Cassandra, however, knew something was wrong. She had seen the fleeting look of panic in Richard's eyes, something rare for a man who always seemed to have everything under control. She also knew that in situations like this, the world around her would continue as if nothing had happened. People would pretend not to notice the tension, to avoid dealing with uncomfortable truths. But Cassandra couldn't ignore it. Something inside her stirred. She had spent her whole life being unseen, unheard. She had always been the one to fade into the background, to serve without complaint. But tonight, she couldn't just stand by. She had to act. The weight of her decision hung in the air as the minutes ticked by. Cassandra made a choice that would change everything. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling ever so slightly, and dialed the number Richard had just dismissed. It wasn't a random decision. She knew who to call. And as the phone rang, she held her breath, knowing the world she had once known was about to shift forever. As Cassandra held her breath, the phone rang again. Richard had barely acknowledged the call earlier, dismissing it with an air of arrogance that only a billionaire CEO like him could afford. But now, standing in the restaurant with the tension still lingering in the air, Cassandra knew that this moment was different. This wasn't just another night serving wine and clearing plates. She was about to do something that could turn the tables, something that could change the course of an entire life. Her heart raced as she waited for someone on the other end of the line to pick up. She didn't know if Richard would believe the truth, but it was time to tell him. The phone finally clicked, and she spoke. "Mr. Kessler, This is Cassandra. I know you didn't take the call earlier, but your son is in danger. He's unconscious, and you need to come now. This isn't a joke, it's real. You have to trust me." The silence that followed was deafening. She could almost hear Richard's breath catch on the other end of the line. For a moment, it felt like the world stood still. Cassandra's grip tightened around the phone, her palms sweating. She had never been this direct before, had never stepped out of her role as a waitress to play a part in someone else's life so boldly. But she could feel it, deep inside. Something wasn't right. This was more than just a moment of crisis. It was a turning point for both her and Richard. His voice broke the silence. "Who is this? Why should I believe you? I don't even know you." His words were sharp, tinged with skepticism, but there was a hint of desperation underneath. Cassandra swallowed, trying to steady her nerves. "I'm a waitress at the Waitress lounge. I know you don't care about people like me, but your son needs you now. You don't have much time. Please, I'm telling you, you need to come." She could almost feel the hesitation on the other end. Richard Kessler, the man who controlled billions of dollars, who had built his empire with a hard hand and a sharp mind, was now faced with something he couldn't control. His wealth, his connections, his power, none of it mattered. Not now. Not when his son's life was on the line. He didn't respond right away. The minutes stretched on, like an eternity. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I'm coming," he said, his tone shifting, no longer filled with the arrogance that had defined him for so long. "Where are you?" "I'll get there as fast as I can." Cassandra's heart sank in relief. But she knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. She directed him to the address of her small apartment, knowing the man would have to leave his luxury world behind for a while. As she hung up, she took a deep breath. She didn't know what to expect when Richard arrived. She didn't know if he'd even make it in time. But in that moment, Cassandra understood something. She wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who had the power to change the course of events, to bring someone down from their high horse and remind them of what truly mattered. Richard Kessler had built his empire through sheer force, but he had never been forced to confront something like this. It was a test of his humanity, his priorities. And Cassandra was about to see if he could pass it. The storm outside had started to die down, but the tension in the restaurant had only grown. The soft jazz music continued to play, but it no longer seemed to fill the space. Everything felt eerily still. Cassandra kept moving around the restaurant, her steps automatic, but her mind was elsewhere. She was no longer just working the tables. She was waiting for a man who had never seen her for who she really was. Waiting for him to come to terms with the fact that, in this moment, she was his only hope. Meanwhile, Richard Kessler was making his way through the streets of San Francisco, still grappling with the news he had just received. He had spent his entire life trying to maintain control, to bend the world to his will. But this was different. His son, the one person in the world he had always tried to protect, was now the one thing he couldn't control. As he drove through the streets, Richard couldn't help but think about the irony. All the money, all the power in the world, and it could do nothing to help him now. He wasn't just racing against time. He was racing against a reality he had never prepared for. Cassandra had done more than just answer the phone. She had made him see that, in this world, even the people who are invisible can make a difference. And as he neared her apartment, Richard couldn't help but wonder, who was the real power in this situation? The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets of San Francisco slick and glistening beneath the soft glow of streetlights. Richard Kessler's car pulled up outside Cassandra's apartment building, its tires making a faint squeal on the wet pavement. The storm had passed, but the tension in the air was still palpable. Richard stepped out of the car, his tailored suit now slightly damp from the rain. His usual confidence had been replaced with a noticeable sense of urgency, a feeling he wasn't accustomed to. He had made millions, built an empire, and yet in this moment, he felt completely out of his depth. He wasn't sure what to expect when he walked into that apartment. Would Cassandra be waiting for him, ready to offer more answers? Would her words ring true, or had he been dragged into something bigger than himself? As he made his way up the stairs, he tried to calm his racing thoughts. He was a CEO, used to making life-changing decisions at the drop of a hat. But now, standing in front of an apartment that wasn't his own, it felt as though the world had shifted. Inside, Cassandra was waiting. She had been pacing back and forth in the small apartment, a part of her still unable to believe the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just some mistake or a bad joke. This was real. Richard Kessler, the man who owned the city's most influential tech company, was now standing in her world, needing her help. She didn't know why she had chosen to take this step, why she had reached out to him, but something deep inside told her it was the right thing to do. When Richard knocked on the door, it was as if time had stopped. Cassandra took a deep breath and opened the door. He stood there, looking lost, his gaze darting nervously as he searched her face for any sign of what was to come. She stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. He did, cautiously, his eyes scanning the modest apartment, taking in the simple furnishings that were a far cry from his luxurious penthouse. "Where is he?" Richard asked, his voice low, tinged with worry. "He's in the back," Cassandra replied, her tone firm but kind. She led him to the small bedroom where her son, still in his pajamas, sat on the edge of the bed. The room was a far cry from the polished, sterile environments Richard was used to. It was warm, filled with the scent of lavender, a soft contrast to the tension in the air. "This is my son, Amara," Cassandra said, motioning to the girl who had been sitting quietly by the window, her eyes focused on the storm outside. Amara looked up as Richard entered the room, her expression unreadable. She had seen her mother work with the rich and powerful before, but never like this. The billionaire CEO, the man who seemed so unreachable, was now standing in her world. Amara, a young girl with a quiet strength, stood up slowly and faced him. "Are you here to help?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Richard blinked, clearly taken aback by her question. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. He was used to people deferring to him, to bowing to his every command. But this girl, this child, wasn't fazed by his status. And that made him uneasy. "I'm here to help your mother," Richard replied, his voice softer now, as though the weight of the situation was starting to settle on him. "I'll do whatever it takes." Amara nodded, but there was something in her eyes that made Richard pause. She was testing him. Cassandra watched silently as the moment hung in the air. Richard was no stranger to power dynamics, but this was different. This wasn't a business deal or a negotiation. This was real life. And in this moment, his wealth and status meant nothing. What mattered was whether he could step up and do the right thing. He looked back at Amara, then at Cassandra, and for the first time since entering the apartment, he felt a sense of clarity. "I don't know what to do," Richard admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know I can't do it alone. I need your help." Cassandra stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone," she said softly. "We'll figure this out together." Richard nodded, swallowing his pride. He had always been the one to fix things, to be the one in control. But now, in this small apartment, with these two people who had shown him more compassion than he'd ever expected, he realized that maybe it was time to let go of the control. Maybe it was time to listen. The storm outside had passed, but the real storm was only just beginning. Richard's eyes followed Cassandra's every move as she led him into the small kitchen, where the faint sound of a kettle boiling added a strange sense of normalcy to the chaos unfolding in his life. His mind was still racing from the storm of emotions, but something about the calmness in Cassandra's demeanor grounded him. He had been used to solving problems in boardrooms, not in kitchens. He had always seen himself as a fixer, a man with all the answers. But here, in this modest apartment, he was confronted with a different reality. A reality where his wealth meant nothing, where his power was useless. As he stood in the kitchen, watching Cassandra prepare a simple meal, he felt a humbling realization settle in his chest. She wasn't just some waitress. She was someone who had been through more than he could imagine. Someone who had seen the worst of what life had to offer and still found a way to keep going. "How do you do it?" Richard asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Cassandra paused, glancing over her shoulder as she set a pot of soup on the stove. She didn't immediately respond, as if weighing the question, choosing her words carefully. Finally, she said, "You just keep moving forward. You don't have a choice. The world doesn't stop for anyone, especially not for people like me." Richard stood still, his gaze fixed on her as she stirred the soup. He had never really understood what it meant to struggle. Sure, he had faced challenges, but they were always financial, always in the context of his empire. He had never had to worry about where his next meal would come from or whether he could afford the things that mattered most. He had never had to fight just to be seen. Cassandra set the spoon down, wiping her hands on a towel before turning to face him. "It's not easy," she continued, her voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of strength. "But you learn to rely on yourself. You learn to see the world for what it really is, not what you want it to be. And when you get knocked down, you just get back up. There's no other choice." Richard couldn't help but feel a shift inside him. He had always thought he understood what it meant to be strong. But here, in the presence of this woman, he was beginning to realize how little he actually knew. He had built his empire on the backs of others, relying on his position of power to get what he wanted. But power wasn't what was needed in this moment. In this moment, all that mattered was doing the right thing. "I've been a fool," Richard muttered, more to himself than to her. Cassandra didn't say anything in response. Instead, she gave him a small nod, as if acknowledging the truth of his words without needing to speak. She knew what it was like to be overlooked, to be underestimated. She knew what it was like to have to prove yourself over and over again, just to be seen. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared understanding hanging in the air between them. Outside, the streets of San Francisco were finally quiet, the chaos of the storm now a distant memory. Inside the apartment, however, the storm was far from over. Richard still had a decision to make. He knew he couldn't go back to the way things were. He couldn't go back to a life where power and money were all that mattered. Cassandra had opened his eyes to a new reality, one where empathy and compassion were worth more than the billions he had accumulated. It was a reality he hadn't wanted to face, but now he had no choice. "What do I need to do?" Richard asked, his voice calm, the weight of the question pressing down on him. Cassandra looked at him for a long moment before answering. "You need to go to your son. You need to be there for him. Not as the CEO, not as the billionaire, but as a father. You need to show him that he matters, that he's worth something." The words hit Richard harder than he expected. He had always thought he was doing what was best for his son, pushing him to follow in his footsteps, to take over his empire. But in that moment, he realized that he had been so focused on building a legacy that he had forgotten to build a relationship. He had been so consumed with success that he had neglected what truly mattered. "And after that?" Richard asked, his voice quieter now. "After that," Cassandra replied, "you figure out who you really are. You figure out what kind of man you want to be. Because right now, I'm not sure I know the answer to that." Richard nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent his entire life building a name for himself, but he had never stopped to ask himself why. Now, standing in this small apartment, with this woman who had shown him more humanity than anyone else, he was finally ready to find out. He turned and walked to the door, his mind made up. It wasn't going to be easy, but he knew what he had to do. He had to start over. He had to rebuild, not just his company, but his life. And it started with his son. Richard arrived at the hospital with a sense of urgency he had never felt before. The weight of his actions, the words spoken by Cassandra, and the reality of his son's condition all collided in his chest, making it hard to breathe. He had spent so many years building an empire, but now, in the face of real human vulnerability, he felt helpless. As he rushed through the hospital corridors, the sterile walls and the hurried footsteps of doctors and nurses seemed to blur together. Nothing around him mattered anymore except getting to his son. When he reached the room, he hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside. There, lying in the bed, was his son, Alex. The young man was pale, his face calm despite the gravity of the situation. He had always been strong, following in his father's footsteps, pushing forward even when it was difficult. But now, he was vulnerable. Richard walked to his son's bedside and stood there, watching him with a mixture of guilt and concern. It had been years since he had really looked at Alex, really seen him for who he was. For so long, he had been focused on business, on building his legacy, on ensuring the future of his company. But now, standing here, he saw the young man he had raised, the son he had pushed so hard. And in that moment, he realized just how much he had neglected him. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was Cassandra. She had followed him to the hospital, though she had no obligation to do so. Richard had told her he could handle it, but she insisted. Now, here she was, standing in the doorway, watching the two of them. She didn't speak at first, but Richard could feel her presence behind him, strong and steady. "I didn't know what to say," Richard said softly, his voice carrying the weight of his regret. "I spent my whole life building an empire, but I forgot to be a father. Cassandra stepped into the room, her gaze never leaving Alex's still form. It's not too late, she said quietly. You're here now? That's what matters. Richard nodded, his eyes filling with a mix of emotion. He had spent his life controlling everything around him, but he could never control what was most important, his relationship with his son. He had ignored it, thinking he could fix things later, but later had come far too late. Now, with Cassandra's guidance, he understood that it was never about the money, the power, or the business. It was about being present, about showing up when it mattered most. As Richard stood there, the weight of everything he had neglected settled in, but so did a sense of clarity. He wasn't just here to fix things with Alex. He was here to be with him, to make up for all the times he had missed. I don't know where to start, Richard admitted, his voice shaking slightly. But I'm going to try. Cassandra gave him a soft smile. That's all anyone can do. Try. And keep trying. Richard nodded again, his eyes still fixed on Alex. The doctor had told him that Alex's condition was stable for now, that he was out of immediate danger. But Richard knew that the real work, the real healing, would be in the days, months, and years to come. It would be in the effort he put into rebuilding the relationship he had neglected for so long. He turned to Cassandra, his gaze filled with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You've done more for me today than anyone ever has. Cassandra shook her head. I didn't do it for you, Richard. I did it for him. And for you too. You don't have to do this alone, but you have to want to make it right. That's the first step. Richard's heart felt heavier than it had ever felt, but it wasn't just with regret anymore. There was hope there too. Hope that, despite everything, he could start over. Hope that he could rebuild his life. Not just with business, but with people. With Alex. He sat down beside his son's bed, taking his hand in his. I'm here, son. I'm here. The silence in the room was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that spoke of healing, of second chances, of a new beginning. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt as though he had finally taken the first step toward redemption. The storm outside had passed, and in its wake, the city seemed calmer. But inside this room, a new storm was beginning. A storm of change, of growth, and of the kind of love that could only come from the most difficult of truths. Richard didn't know where this journey would take him, but he knew one thing for sure. He would not face it alone. As the days passed, Richard stayed by his son's side, a quiet presence in the sterile hospital room. The weight of his past decisions seemed to linger in the air, a constant reminder of how far he had strayed from what truly mattered. Alex had started to recover, but Richard knew that physical healing was only the beginning. His son's emotional wounds would take much longer to heal, and that was something Richard had no experience in fixing. He had always been the man with all the answers, the CEO who could solve any problem with a deal or a decision. But now, as he sat in the hospital chair, watching his son sleep, he realized that some problems could not be solved with money or power. It was the first time in a long while that Richard had truly felt powerless. Cassandra had been right. His empire, his money, his influence, they all meant nothing in this moment. What mattered was being present, showing his son that he was there, that he cared, that he would not make the same mistake again. Richard took a deep breath and stood up, walking over to the window. The city stretched out before him, the fog still lingering in the air. He had always been able to control his surroundings, to bend the world to his will. But now, he was learning that the world didn't revolve around him. He could no longer command it. He could only navigate it. And as he looked at the city below, he realized that this was his chance to rebuild, not just his company, but his life, his family. He had to rebuild the trust he had lost with Alex. He had to find a way to be a father to his son, not just a CEO. Richard turned away from the window, his eyes falling back on Alex. The boy was starting to stir, his eyelids fluttering open as he slowly regained consciousness. Richard's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know how to start this conversation, didn't know how to make up for all the years he had missed. But he knew he had to try. He walked over to the bed, his steps tentative. Hey, buddy, Richard said softly, his voice filled with emotion. How are you feeling? Alex blinked a few times, his eyes slowly focusing on his father. He looked confused, still groggy from the medication, but there was something in his gaze that made Richard's chest tighten. I don't know. Alex muttered, his voice raspy. What happened? Richard sat down beside him, trying to hide the lump in his throat. You had a bit of a scare, but you're okay now. He paused, struggling to find the right words. I'm so sorry, Alex. For everything. I should have been there for you more. I should have been a better father. Alex didn't say anything for a moment. He just stared at his father, as if processing what he had just heard. The silence in the room stretched on, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt necessary. Finally, Alex spoke, his voice quieter now. You weren't there, Dad. You were always working, always too busy for me. I felt like I didn't matter. Richard's heart sank at the words. He knew that Alex had felt abandoned, but hearing it out loud hit him harder than he had imagined. I didn't mean for you to feel that way, Richard said, his voice cracking. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I built enough for us, you'd see that I was doing it for you. But I was wrong. I see that now. Alex was silent again, his eyes drifting to the window. I don't know if I can fix what's been broken, Richard continued, his voice thick with emotion. But I'm here now, and I'm going to try. I promise you that. Alex looked at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. How? Richard sighed, looking down at his hands. I'm not sure yet, but I'm going to be here. I'm going to listen. I'm going to try to make up for all the time I lost. Alex's expression softened slightly, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he just nodded, as if unsure of what to make of his father's words. Richard sat there in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything still pressing down on him. He didn't know what the future held, or if his relationship with Alex could ever be fully repaired. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a chance, an opportunity to be the father he had always wanted to be. And that, he realized, was all he could ask for. As the days turned into weeks, Richard kept his promise. He spent every moment he could with Alex, not as the CEO, not as the powerful businessman, but as a father. They talked, really talked, for the first time in years. Richard listened to Alex, heard his frustrations, his pain, his hopes for the future. It wasn't easy. There were days when Richard felt like he was getting nowhere, when the weight of his past mistakes seemed too much to bear. But slowly, little by little, the walls between them began to break down. Richard had always thought he could fix everything with money or power, but now he knew that the only thing that could fix what had been broken was time, patience, and a willingness to change. And for the first time in his life, Richard was ready to do whatever it took to rebuild his relationship with his son. Weeks had passed since Richard began his journey to rebuild his relationship with Alex. The days were long, filled with conversations that, while difficult, were necessary. Richard found himself waking up each day with a new sense of purpose, no longer burdened by the corporate world and the demands of his empire. Instead, he focused on what mattered most, being there for his son. Alex, though still uncertain, had begun to open up. He was slowly letting down the walls that had kept his emotions at bay for so long. Richard could see the change in him, less distant, less guarded. But there were still moments of silence, moments when the weight of their past would hang between them like an invisible barrier. One afternoon, after spending the entire day together, Richard and Alex were sitting on the porch of Richard's house. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the landscape, but the air between them was still thick with unspoken words. Richard glanced over at Alex, who was staring out into the distance, his hands clasped together. The quiet had become a familiar companion, but Richard knew it was time to break it. You know, I never really understood what it meant to be a father, Richard said softly, his voice steady. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I built something big enough, you'd see how much I cared. But it wasn't enough. And I can't change the past, Alex. But I can be here now. Alex turned his head, meeting his father's eyes. I know you're trying, he said quietly. I just don't know if it's enough. I've been so angry at you for so long, Dad. I don't know how to just let that go. Richard's heart tightened at the honesty in his son's voice. It was a reminder of all the years he had wasted, all the time he had missed. But it was also a sign that Alex was finally starting to process the pain, to let it out instead of holding it in. I don't expect you to forget, Alex, Richard replied. But I'm here now, and I'm going to keep showing up. I can't fix what's been broken, but I can be a part of fixing it. That's all I can do. Alex looked down at his hands, his fingers fiddling with the sleeve of his shirt. It's hard, Dad. You can't just fix things with a few good days. Richard nodded, understanding. I know. It'll take time. It'll take effort. but I'm willing to put in the work. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to be a father to you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, the sound of distant traffic faded away, and it was just Richard and Alex, two people trying to find their way back to each other. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was real, and that, Richard knew, was a start. The next few weeks were filled with small steps forward. Richard spent less time in meetings and more time with Alex. They did the small things, shared meals, watched movies together, went to a baseball game, just the two of them. It was in these moments, Richard realized, that the real healing happened. It wasn't the grand gestures or the big declarations. It was the simple, everyday moments that built the foundation of their relationship. One evening, as they were sitting in the living room, watching a documentary on space exploration, Alex spoke up. "You know, I've always wanted to go to space," he said, his eyes still glued to the screen. "I used to think it was a pipe dream, but now I'm not so sure." Richard smiled, a rare, genuine smile that lit up his face. "Maybe you'll be the one to make it happen," he said. "You never know." Alex looked at his father, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Maybe. The words were simple, but they meant something. They were a sign that Alex was beginning to see possibilities again, to dream again, something Richard hadn't seen in him for a long time. As the days went by, Richard continued to show up. He wasn't perfect. He still made mistakes, still struggled with the balance between being a father and being the CEO he had once been. But every day he tried. And every day, Alex saw it. He saw his father trying. And that, in itself, was enough. One afternoon, as they were walking through the park, Alex turned to Richard. "I think I'm ready to talk about some of the things I've been holding in," he said, his voice steady. Richard stopped walking and looked at his son, his heart swelling with pride. "Whenever you're ready, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. I'm always here." And with that, the walls between them began to crumble. It wasn't a magical moment, but it was real. Richard had no illusions that everything would be fixed in an instant. But in that moment, he knew they were on the right path. And that, he realized, was all he needed to keep going. Together, they would rebuild their relationship, one step at a time. Months had passed since Richard and Alex began their journey of healing, and while the road had been long and filled with challenges, there was a sense of peace that had started to settle between them. It wasn't a perfect relationship, nor would it ever be, but it was theirs. Richard had shown up when it mattered, and Alex had opened up in ways that seemed impossible just a few months ago. They were learning to be a family again. One quiet evening, as they sat together in the living room, Richard looked at his son with a sense of gratitude he couldn't quite put into words. The bond they shared now was different, stronger than before. Alex had spent the last few weeks talking to him more openly, sharing his thoughts and dreams that had once been buried deep inside. He had even started applying to colleges, something Richard had never expected him to do. For the first time, Alex was thinking about his future, and it was clear he wasn't just going through the motions to please his father. This was his own decision. Richard knew the weight of his past mistakes would never fully disappear, but this felt like a chance for a new beginning. They had learned to listen to each other, to understand that their journey wasn't about achieving perfection, but about the small moments that built trust and love. One evening, as they were finishing dinner, Alex suddenly looked at Richard with a thoughtful expression. "Dad, there's something I've been meaning to say," Alex started, his voice tentative but clear. Richard put down his fork and turned to him, giving him his full attention. "What's on your mind?" Alex hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I know things haven't been easy between us. You know, for a long time, I didn't think you cared. But I see now that you do. I see how much you're trying, and it means more than I can say." Richard's heart swelled at his son's words. It wasn't easy for Alex to speak so openly, and it took everything within Richard not to let the emotions overwhelm him. "I know I haven't always been there when you needed me," Richard replied, his voice quiet. "But I'm here now. I'm going to keep showing up, no matter what. I can't change the past, but I'll be here for your future." Alex nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I think that's all I ever really wanted. To know you were there." Richard reached across the table, placing his hand over Alex's. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it spoke volumes. The space between them, once filled with years of distance and misunderstanding, was slowly closing. They were no longer father and son merely by name. They were father and son by choice, by effort, and by the hard work they both put in. You know, Alex continued, his voice lighter now, I've been thinking about that trip you mentioned, the one to the Grand Canyon. I think it's about time we take that trip. Just you and me. I want to spend time with you. I want to do something that's not about business, not about school, but just us. Richard looked at his son, stunned by the sincerity in his words. He never expected this. Never imagined that Alex would ask for something like this. I'd love that, Richard replied, his voice thick with emotion. I think it's exactly what we both need. The conversation turned to other topics, but the air between them felt different. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt like he wasn't just trying to fix things. He was living them. He was no longer fighting against the past, but embracing the future, one step at a time. Over the next few weeks, Richard made changes in his life. Not for his company or his public image, but for his family. He took less time in the office, spent more time with Alex, and made it a point to be present. They planned their trip to the Grand Canyon. A simple trip to spend time together and make memories that weren't tainted by ambition or regret. It wasn't just about the trip, it was about the promise he had made to be a father, not just a provider. The night before they were set to leave, Richard stood in the doorway of Alex's room, watching his son pack for the trip. Alex looked up and smiled. You know, I never thought we'd get here, Alex said, his voice filled with a hint of, oh, but I'm glad we did. Richard smiled back, his heart full. Me too, son. Me too. The trip was everything they both needed. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. They hiked through the canyon together, talked about things that mattered, and shared moments of laughter. By the time they reached the bottom of the canyon and looked up at the vast expanse of the sky, Richard realized something. It wasn't just about the journey to the bottom of the canyon. It was about the journey they had taken to get there, together. They had both changed. They had both grown. And in that moment, Richard knew that, no matter what happened in the future, this trip, this time together, was the foundation of something that would last. When they returned home, Richard felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The work wasn't done, but it had begun. He had started to rebuild, not just his empire, but his relationship with Alex. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt like he was finally where he needed to be. It had been months since Richard and Alex returned from their trip to the Grand Canyon. The time they spent together had marked the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. Slowly but surely, they were rebuilding their relationship, one conversation at a time, one moment of connection at a time. Richard had kept his promise to be there, to show up in ways that mattered, not just with grand gestures, but with the small, everyday acts that built trust and love. The change wasn't instantaneous. There were still moments of silence, still moments of doubt, but those moments were becoming fewer and further between. Alex was opening up, not just to Richard, but to the world around him. He had started applying for colleges, something Richard had once pushed him to do without considering whether it was what Alex truly wanted. But now, Alex was pursuing his own path, making decisions for himself. Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had finally learned that success wasn't about building an empire, but about nurturing the relationships that mattered most. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Alex turned to Richard with a thoughtful look on his face. Dad, Alex began, his voice steady but unsure. I've been thinking about something. I know it's been a lot for both of us, and I want to thank you for being there, for trying. Richard's heart swelled at his son's words. You don't have to thank me, Alex, Richard replied. I should have been there a long time ago. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Alex nodded, his eyes a little softer than they had been before. I know. It's just, I've spent so long being angry, you know? I didn't want to let go of that anger because I thought it was all I had. But now, I see things differently. I see you differently. Richard smiled, his chest tightening with emotion. I'm glad. That's all I've ever wanted, Alex. For you to see that I'm trying, that I care. The room fell into a comfortable silence, one that didn't feel heavy or forced. For the first time in a long time, they were just two people, father and son, sitting together and truly being together. Over the next few months, their bond continued to grow. Alex finished his high school year, and Richard, who had stepped back from his corporate duties, made sure he was there to see every step of the journey. They celebrated Alex's graduation, not with a huge party or extravagant gifts, but with quiet pride, knowing they had both come a long way. Alex was accepted into a college on the East Coast, and though it was hard for Richard to imagine his son so far away, he knew this was part of the journey. Alex was taking the next step into his own future, something Richard could never control, but something he now fully supported. On the day Alex left for college, Richard stood with him at the airport, watching as his son prepared to board the plane. There was no grand speech, no promises of grandeur, just a simple moment of understanding. "I'm proud of you, son," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "Go and make your own path. Don't let anyone tell you who you should be." Alex smiled, his eyes bright with the excitement and nervousness of starting a new chapter. "I will, Dad. And thank you for everything." As Richard watched Alex walk through the security gate, he felt a mix of emotions. Pride, sadness, hope. His son was growing up, moving on, and Richard had finally come to terms with the fact that he couldn't hold on to him forever. But he had done something far more important than that. He had let him go. Richard took a deep breath, standing still for a moment, as the realization of everything that had happened washed over him. He had rebuilt what he thought was lost, and though it had been painful and hard, it had been worth it. He had learned that the greatest legacy he could leave behind wasn't a corporation or a fortune, but the love and trust of the people he cared about. And as Alex disappeared into the crowd, Richard knew that this was just the beginning. His relationship with Alex wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that, he realized, was enough. In this powerful and emotional journey, we follow the story of a billionaire CEO who is forced to confront his past mistakes and rebuild his relationship with his son. The story highlights the struggles of a father who had prioritized his business over his family and how, through vulnerability and effort, he begins to learn the true value of connection. As the CEO tries to make amends, we witness the gradual healing of a father-son bond that was once broken by neglect. This is not just a tale about wealth and power, but about love, growth, and second chances. With each step, the CEO learns that real strength comes from being present, and the most valuable things in life cannot be bought. As the journey unfolds, we discover that even the most hardened individuals can change when they open themselves to love and empathy. This story is a beautiful example of the transformative power of human connection, a narrative that resonates deeply with audiences who appreciate the lessons found in Black stories. The evolution of their relationship reminds us that forgiveness, patience, and understanding are the keys to healing, and that true success is measured by the relationships we build, not the fortunes we accumulate. As father and son continue their journey, we see how this Black story speaks not only to their struggles, but also to the universal truth of redemption. For those who believe in the power of family and the importance of making things right, this narrative offers a touching and hopeful message. These Black stories are often hidden in the noise of everyday life, but when given the chance, they reveal the raw, unspoken truths that can change lives forever. In the end, the CEO's journey of self-discovery and reconciliation with his son leaves a lasting impression, proving that redemption is always possible when we choose love and understanding over pride and power. Through these Black stories, we see the beauty of transformation and the impact of choosing to show up, no matter the circumstances.